I have a question for you, my fellow RTS fans. What should we call this real-time strategy subgenre of games which are designed with base building and defense gameplay, mixed with horde/wave survival, and often having some tower defense and/or roguelike elements as well? This RTS subgenre I just described has been growing even before their billions came out in 2017. But has certainly exploded in popularity since then. You probably played some of these games today or last week, have some of them installed right now, or have watched an entire playthrough from one of your favorite content creators about them. Just recently we got several more such games like Here Comes the Swarm and Calyx, and more on the horizon like Repterra and Dawn of Defense. While if we look back, there were Creeper World, Conan Unconquered, There Are Billions, Diplomacy is Not an Option, Age of Darkness, Final Stand, From Glory to Goo, Cataclysmo, Alien Marauder, Last Outpost and Thronefall, and there are more depending on how wide the net you want to cast and how much you relax the classification. Some of you might consider Riftbreaker or Mindustry to fit this description, and you are free to add any I missed in the comments below, while I will link store pages of all the games I mentioned during the video in the description. But what bothers me is how there is no single unifying name for this subgenre, like how we call real-time strategy games, which have no base building or resource collection, real-time tactical games. So instead, we have a bunch of different Steam tags on these new games I have mentioned, and they go from strategy, survival, base building, RTS, all the way to zombies, colony sim, real time with pause, resource management and the like. Therefore, in trying to choose a suitable name for this specific RTS subgenre, I thought to myself, we first have to discover what is the core feature of these games and which one do they all share. And so, for me, the most obvious place to start was the base building element, as I could remember and find it in absolutely each and every one of these games. Granted, some have much more variety in this aspect, with not just defensive towers, but walls, resource collection or generation buildings, and even unit recruitment buildings. For example, in Diplomacy is Not an Option, you have several collectible resources, both wood and stone walls, many different types of towers, even traps and lots of different units, especially considering that its developers have polished several factions by now. It's almost a fully fledged RTS game, except it is missing just one main element, the enemy base. This is on par with the experience in Here Comes the Swarm, There Are Billions, and several other games, with the only exception being that some have more or less units or buildings available to you, and some have heroes or special powers and others do not. But then I realized if I continued this path of reasoning, I would just end up with a name for this subgenre that would be something like base building or defense builder RTS games. The problem with that is obviously that many of us already use that distinction to explain if a regular kind of RTS game has base building as a feature, which is kind of strange when you think about it, as we already have the RTT designation for RTS games which don't have base building, but that hides the fact that RTT games also lack resource collection. But it goes deeper than that, because you can remove base building, keep resource collection, and still have an RTS game if you keep the ability to produce your own units during battles out of the collected resources. Homeworld being one of the most obvious examples, and there are certainly others, interestingly enough, mostly space-themed games. On the other hand, those real-time tactical games where you have no base building or resource collection, but you can bring in more units off map by using some form of points, most often seem to be modern or World War II themed games. There is food for thought there, and I would be curious to see how many RTT games you could name down in the comments which don't have a modern or World War II theme, and also RTS games without base building but with resource collection and unit production which aren't space themed. So, as it turns out, base building as a feature is not the main element we can use to distinguish these games I'm talking about in this video. Also, there are base building games where you don't have more than a single unit/character, like for example Riftbreaker, or very few units like in Cataclysmo or Conan Unconquered. This means heroes, units and the side of the gameplay you control is quite varied across these games, making it difficult to pin down and use for creating a name for this RTS subgenre. The only common theme I could see here is something I already mentioned, and it is connected to base building, but outside the player's control, and that is the lack of an enemy's base. But unfortunately we have an outlier here too, which is Calyx, and in that game you do have an enemy base you can see on the map and in fact destroy it to end the enemy attacks on your base. There are even two types of such bases. The more regular kind, which can produce units not unlike your own, but controlled by the hostile liquidator, and of course Calyx plants, which spread their biological body all over the map, ultimately trying to grow over your base as well. So, RTS games with no enemy base as a subgenre name is unusable, and it would also sound very silly anyway. Baseless enemy RTS? Non-based enemy RTS? Yeah, that's not gonna work. And on that funny note, I don't think we could use the active pause system many of these games have as a basis for naming the subgenre as well, for one main reason. Some other RTS games also give you the ability to give commands to units or place buildings during pause, so active pause is not exclusive to the games which are the topic of this video, meaning that RTS games with pause won't work for us. On a side note, having the ability to control units while paused in these kinds of games is a huge help, as players can easily be overwhelmed with information and things to do. When you have resource collection, research, unit training, armies to command, base and defenses to construct, being able to pause and do each stress-free is a welcome addition to the gameplay. I would say that this system even makes these kinds of games more new player friendly, and not just new to a game, but to the genre in general. And so, these kinds of games bring in fresh new players, people who might have never played RTS games before, as these are inherently single player, with a few exceptions of those which have co-op game modes, like Age of Darkness Final Stand or Riftbreaker for example. If anyone watching this video started playing RTS games after getting into the genre from one such game, please let me know which one was it in the comments below. Of course, there is the other side of the coin for games with active pause, where players can ignore the option as a sort of a hard mode and open themselves to an even greater challenge if they choose to never use active pause. Whenever I want to be extra hard and brutal to myself, I try playing Diplomacy is Not an Option or Here Comes the Swarm without hitting pause, and let me tell you, I start sweating bullets by the end. It can be a really cool challenge, and it not only teaches you to multitask very efficiently, but also how to handle stressful situations where things just keep getting out of hand. This is a real-world skill you need, especially in the very dynamic and, let's say, interesting times we live in right now. Anyway, I digress. This leaves me with the only remaining aspect these games share. This is the enemies which attack you and your base. Because regardless if you're playing Calyx, Age of Darkness Final Stand, or even Riftbreaker, this one gameplay element remains constant. Lots and lots of enemies trying to overwhelm your base and defenses, and while some games mix in large and high HP opponents, most if not all rely on huge numbers. And even more importantly, the design of how these enemies attack you remains the same across all these games, which is hordes and waves. Granted, in their billions or Diplomacy is Not an Option, enemy numbers go well into thousands at the same time, while Cataclysmo, Calyx or Last Outpost are far smaller in scale, with dozens of enemies per wave. So, could we name this RTS subgenre Wave RTS, Wave Defense RTS, Horde RTS games, Horde Defence RTS? I think we are close with that, but maybe not quite there yet. Now, you could say that survival is another element all these games have in common, and for the most part that is true, but it also does not have to be, because survival can be superseded as a mission objective by something else, like killing the enemy boss, or clearing the map, or collecting a certain amount of resources or units to take into the next mission. I think at this point we have covered all the elements: base building, no enemy base, active pause, waves or hordes of enemies, defense and survival. And listing them out like that actually makes me very proud about how much effort RTS game developers have put into trying to give us new kinds of gameplay and gameplay mixes these last few decades, iterating on the familiar designs but also creating and executing new ideas. On the other hand, let's not forget that making a game with no deep story, characters or narrative is much easier if you choose such a design. Or maybe I shouldn't say easier, just cheaper, because basically all of these games came from indie studios with only a few team members, in some cases even solo indie devs, and very limited funds. I could almost be tempted to name the entire subgenre Poor Man's RTS, but it would be entirely unfair to do so. In the end, my suggestion for naming this subgenre in the future is Base Wave Survival RTS games, and the close second option is Base Defense RTS games. I wish it could be made shorter, but each additional word you lose a huge part of the basic gameplay design these games are based on. And even with 2 words, you just wouldn't be able to cover all of them under one roof. This way, the base part shows us that there are buildings in the game, as the word base means something substantial, permanent and solid from where you can expand or resupply. Wave or defense explains that enemies are coming to you instead of you attacking and destroying the enemy's base, while survival covers the end goal and mission objective that is most common in such games. I hope you agree with me and would love to see which of the two, Base Wave Survival RTS games or Base Defense RTS games, gets more votes in the comments. But of course, as I stated before, please do feel free to try and craft a new name for this RTS subgenre yourselves. I would love to see what you can come up with. For more on these games and many others, check out the cards on the screen or links in the description. Thank you for watching and happy gaming!